11 long years. 11 years I've been running this YouTube channel, making dozens of Let's Plays and commentating over video games for the fun and enjoyment of everyone who watches, and honestly, for myself too. 11 years and we've only scratched the surface when it comes to the number of good quality video games out there. In 2022, I decided to take a very different approach to the way that I make content for this channel. In years past, we never looked at more than a half dozen games or so throughout a given year. This year, we looked at 52. And in the spirit of doing things differently, I've decided to change my approach when it comes to my year-end honorifics. Usually, right before the new year hits, I like to go over my favorite titles that came out over the last 12 months, specifically the ones I actually played. But here's the thing, I've had a bit of a perspective shift over the past couple of years, and maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but I don't really value video games in the same way that I used to. New and fresh is kind of overrated. There are hundreds of thousands of older video games out there just waiting to be discovered and played, and finding a new game that you absolutely love is just as special and inspiring no matter what year that game released. I don't want to confine a list like this to the best games that came out in 2022, but rather the best games we all got to play together in 2022. Here on this channel, to be specific. That's not to say there aren't any brand new games on this list, because there are, but that's more of a happy coincidence than anything. I'm not about to be picky anymore. Like I said, we looked at 52 different video games this year, and this is my top 5. I only have one game amongst those 52 that I am not going to be putting on this list, and that is Ghost of Tsushima, for the singular fact that it was already on last year's list. With all that said, let's start with number 5. I've always had a lot of respect for the Kirby series, while never having a whole lot to do with it personally. The only Kirby game I played a lot of growing up was Kirby Air Ride for the Nintendo GameCube, and that's more or less a spin-off than anything. This series has so much history, a ton of entries, and has gone in more directions than any other Nintendo franchise I can think of, but it's always just kind of been, I don't know, solid? Just solid, like consistently good, and that's actually a very rare quality to have as a franchise. I think it's just the fact that Kirby is such a great concept in its own right. I mean, it's a very safe platformer that gets by because of a stellar sense of art direction and style. Kirby is cute, that's the main reason. He's friggin' adorable, and that adorableness has made for dozens of successful games. He would be the pinnacle of that business model if goddamn Pikachu didn't exist, but whatever. The games are also just pleasant, nice, very easy, never too challenging beyond a few bonus modes and unlockable difficulties. But you know what Kirby's lacked for a long time? A serious shakeup. I mean, it feels like Nintendo pumps one of these games out every couple of years because just as they are simple to play, they're probably relatively simple to make too. But even with a series that has coasted by on doing the same thing so well for so long, it's nice to have a fresh take on the idea. Enter, of course, last year's Kirby and the Forgotten Land, a game I fully expect to see on a lot of people's 2022 lists because, well, it's a fantastic game. I don't think anybody is going to challenge me on that point. But why is it so good exactly? Beyond the perspective shift and the fact that it is the first truly 3D Kirby game, of course. I know my favorite part of this game is the style that it has. More than just the art direction, the world design and the aesthetics therein are simply magical. Just go back and watch my playthrough if you want to hear my absolute wonderment and awe every single time I encounter a cool looking level, which, if I'm going to be honest, is probably all of them. I mean, that really was the game's biggest strength in my opinion. Kirby games have always had a lot of eye candy when it comes to the world he traverses through, but Forgotten Land specifically took that to such a degree and added a layer of creativity on top of it, aided by the post-apocalyptic feel to everything that just made this one aspect bring the game over the top of standard Kirby fare. But there's more to it. The gameplay itself ramps up in several ways. The leveling system for copy abilities, allowing players to enhance each and every one, made for such an engaging idea that I never got tired of any one ability, yet I couldn't get enough of most of them. There were maybe only a couple I wasn't too fond of, but that really came down to personal preference by the end. Using both the combat and the maneuverability features of each power really elevated the ideas beyond anything the Kirby series has done before. And then we have the boss fights. While I don't think there were enough of these personally, they were still a lot of fun and wholly exciting all the way up to the final boss, which I won't spoil it, but it was fantastic. Then there's the whole objective system. With these objectives, you have to rescue Waddle Dees and are rewarded for doing so. While simply finishing a level nets you a few, you need to complete other tasks hidden within the level to get more. Some need to be outright rescued in hidden areas or through specific means, but others are given to you at the end of the level if you manage to accomplish any of the few bonus objectives that level assigns to you. Now, while I wasn't the biggest fan of the fact that these are hidden from you until after you finish the level, it does encourage exploration and replayability is one of this game's strongest aspects. On top of that, while Waddle Dees are necessary to an extent for actual progression, the better utility is the fact that the more you have, the more your little hub world of Waddle Dee Town will grow before your eyes. This is a little place for minigames, items, healing, where you upgrade your copy abilities, and so much more. And it's lovely to just take a load off after a few levels, go chill out there for a while before heading off to the next area. It all just adds to that delightfulness factor that permeates throughout this entire game. Which, it's funny that I say, but oddly enough, I don't think I've ever seen a Kirby game that goes darker and has more stakes than this one. I'm not about to spoil the story or anything, but Forgotten Land really nails its tone down in a way that honestly surprised me. While it's constantly nice to look at, Kirby himself might be the most squishy and adorable he's ever been, and we have this lovable little sidekick named Elfilin who's just, clearly made to be sold as a plush on the Nintendo store later. This game also reaches deep with some really dark atmosphere, scary imagery, and even more terrifying implications based on the themes alone. Never mind the plot details. That contrast is actually super refreshing, because while it's nice every once in a while to just get an absolute overload of cute stimuli, it's equally nice to have those tonal shifts that break up the monotony, which, speaking of monotony, I have to talk about my only gripe with the game, my only major gripe, I would have to say, and that's the Treasure Road stages. While I understand why they're there, I like the challenge and even really had a blast with some of these myself, there were so many of these things, to the point where at times it felt like these made up half the game, and I definitely preferred my time in the actual proper stages to my time in these bonus levels. And the thing is, you need to do them if you want to get all of the upgrades for your copy abilities. It was less of a problem with execution and more saturation, but that's really my biggest problem with the Treasure Roads, and really Kirby and the Forgotten Land as a whole. I absolutely loved this game and was surprised by how much I loved it. I expected a safer, more generic Kirby outing with a bit of a perspective shift and one mouthful gimmick. And I guess in a way it was that. It doesn't shake up the formula too much, but it does improve upon the formula a lot. And reminder, it was already a pretty darn good formula to begin with. In my opinion, this game is Kirby at its absolute best thus far. Speaking of series that never change the formula and rarely shake things up, let's talk about Pokemon. Okay, to say that things are rarely shaking up is a little disingenuous because, much like Kirby, Pokemon is a winning formula. Okay, even that's an understatement. It's the winningest formula in the entire history of media and entertainment, if we want to be blunt about it. In the grand scheme of things, Pokemon has changed quite a bit over the years, but it's always been in increments, too afraid to alienate players and stray away from what works and what sells so well. I love this series, but its quality has never really correlated with success. It's the bare fundamentals that make it that sweet, sweet money that makes Pokemon such an enterprise. That said, I am glad that Game Freak is still willing to put their unique ideas somewhere, even if it has to go to the spin-offs. Because while Pokemon is so strictly and exclusively an RPG, who among us doesn't want to take some pictures of Pokemon, or play as one, running around different playgrounds or dungeon crawling? And listen, all of that is great, but I don't even ask for that much. Just let me play the normal Pokemon shtick. But why don't we try making it an adventure game? Oh, what's that over there? Oh, it's a Legends Arceus. God, what a brilliant, brilliant idea this game is in sheer concept alone, to a point where I do find myself being one of those people who wishes this was the formula going forward. When Legends Arceus came out in January of this past year, I just couldn't put the thing down. I mean, what an amazing idea. In a world where the concept of Pokemon trainers hasn't even materialized, you are effectively a biological researcher, filling out pages of a Pokedex not just by seeing or catching Pokemon, but studying them extensively, watching how they eat, seeing signature moves, catching or battling them in specific ways. It's not a super complicated setup, but it's such a game changer from a mechanical standpoint. Take this idea and modify the world in which the player interacts with the Pokemon to make it more variable, open-ended, and filled with curveballs, and you have effectively taken the monumentally successful formula of Pokemon, completely changed it, and retained its success in almost every single way. I can't sit here and pretend like Legends Arceus' gameplay isn't fundamentally geared towards pre-existing Pokemon fans. I mean, so much of what makes it works hinges on prior knowledge and fundamental understanding of how Pokemon has always worked. It builds upon that base and makes for an even more exciting, more thoughtful, and more layered experience, at least from a Pokedex completion standpoint. The Alpha system as well is an excellent little addition that provides tons of early game challenges that scale with the player as you go throughout the game. Always a threat, always something to conquer. They make for another exciting visual treat beyond the usual shiny hunting fare people look for in Pokemon games. While the actual textures in the game aren't stellar. The art direction itself is more or less fine. It's really the time period of the setting that makes this game work. The context of the setting where people don't understand how Pokemon actually behave or how Pokemon capture technology is still in its infancy. It's just a nice little touch that brings the whole concept together and makes Legends Arceus, I think, the best purely single-player focused Pokemon game we've gotten in ages, quite possibly ever, even if it's almost entirely bucked the sociable aspect of Pokemon, which, let's be honest, is a series-defining trait. There are areas in which Legends Arceus does take a step back, though. The battling system is less complicated and more streamlined, and it barely plays a role at all in the actual game's narrative and progression. And for a series that has always sort of phoned it in and gone halfway or less in the plot department, Legends Arceus didn't even frickin' dial the number. The writers left a post-it note with this one. This dialogue is just awful, and any excitement that could be gleaned from the events of the plot are usually hampered by this, even at the story's most crucial junctures. As I said before, the texture quality is pretty bad, and I think this game could be considered downright ugly when played on a bigger screen. Although, in hindsight, I guess it could be worse, but that's really the extent of all my problems with it. So why is it number 4 when Kirby and the Forgotten Land, a game I definitely had less issues with, sits one spot below at number 5? Well, 1, it's Pokemon. I make no secrets about my love for this series on the channel. I mean, what is the channel's name? What is it? There isn't a single major Pokemon release I flat out dislike. I just like some more than others, but I really, really love this series. Legends Arceus is, most importantly, an extremely fun game. It's the gameplay loop that makes it what it is. It excels in quite possibly the most important area, an area so crucial that it kind of defines what video games are to most people. I think they can be more complicated than that, certainly, but fun factor is one of those things where I can find a game, and if that's all it has, that's all it needs. And if that fun factor can persist for hours and hours and even days on end, then that's it. It's a success. Legends Arceus is pure entertainment. It takes the Pokemon formula and makes it the most exciting and interesting it's been since Generation 1. While it falls short in other areas, I've got other Pokemon games that do those things just fine. If I want a good battle system, I got plenty of options. If I want good visuals, I can go back to Pokemon Black and White's beautiful pixel art. If I want good plot, I'll probably read the manga, but Pokemon Black and White are close. If I want to just have a really fun time with Pokemon, though, Legends Arceus is at or very near the top for me. And that alone, for such a storied and personally important series, is, I think, very deserving of a number 4 on this list. I'm going to try to keep this one a little shorter than the last two, because this isn't even the first time I've put this in a year-end honorifics video. Back when it came out in 2016, I named Forza Horizon 3 as my 8th favorite game of that year, which in hindsight is horrifically low, considering this is my favorite racing game of all time. But I didn't get to say a whole lot back then neither, so I'm going to try to quantify this game as simply and as efficiently as possible today, so you can understand why I Let's Played it and why it's here at number 3. I do like racing games, to an extent. I've always preferred more open city, freeform racing to your average track racer. Give me Burnout Paradise over Grid, for example. Give me Forza Horizon over Forza Motorsport. Give me Midnight Club 3 over Need for Speed Most Wanted. There are exceptions, of course, like The Crew isn't really a favorite, and I love me some Midnight Club 3, but I kinda hate the rest of that series. I don't know, it sounds weird and picky, and like it doesn't all make sense, but let me tell you about another type of racing game I like. The Anti-Gravity Racer. Redout, F-Zero, Wipeout, Extreme G, Fast RMX, high octane, high speeds, difficult, or even insanely tough, and arcadey as all hell. I like arcadey racers. I like racing games that don't try to go too realistic, especially when it comes to the pace. Now, you might look at Forza Horizon as a very realistic racing game from the outside, but you'd be dead wrong. Aside from the presentation and the visuals, Forza Horizon truly is just an action-packed, fast-paced adventure game in a car enthusiast's clothing. These games do absolutely allow you to take a more realistic angle, but it's not required. You are set out in an open world, and it is your oyster. You can do races, stunts, hunt for collectibles, drive up mountains, hit a jump, do a flip, challenge friends, break stuff, build your collection, get rich, get stupid, and just have a damn fun time doing it. The essence of what makes Forza Horizon good is that attitude, and even if it's a little basic, a little cringy at times, when you turn these games on, you just kinda don't care. You play it and you have fun. There is an essence about this series that no other racing series has ever managed to consistently capture, and if there's one game in the series that totally and completely embodies that essence better than any other, it's the third game. By now, you probably know that Forza Horizon is more of a live service sort of thing, and in a way, it's kind of been that since the start, but it's really leaned into the idea more and more with every subsequent release. I think there's a fine line where live service mechanics can absolutely enhance a game or be a detriment to it, and Horizon 3 is certainly riding that line. Its predecessor still had room to grow, and its successor unfortunately ruined some of the solid fundamentals that were in place. Right here is where it's perfect. You have a good 30, 40 hours or more of content before you ever touch any of the expansions, and that's just at a bare minimum. This game is a car racing playground, and I absolutely love it. It has its frustrations here and there, some weird quirks, some physics issues, and in my opinion, an entire expansion that just kind of doesn't even work. But even taking that out of the equation, I've never felt more fulfilled and had so much fun with a racing game before this. This game is the logical endpoint, the best possible conclusion in a series of wants, hopes, and dreams I've had for racing games since I was 10 years old. That's really it. It's just fun. And not only is it the best at what it tries to do, I think at the rate we're going, we'll never get anything of its ilk that's better than Forza Horizon 3. I've been asked a few times before what my absolute favorite game of the last generations of consoles was, and I always give the same answer. It was Doom, 100%. An absolute masterpiece of a game. But I always make sure to follow that up with my very close second choice, and every time I do, I hear some sort of dismissive comment or a complete lack of interest, and it's kind of a kick in the teeth every single time. Of all my favorite games, I have never had a harder time convincing people to play any of them than I have with Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, I'm just going to come right out and say it. In a few of these instances, yeah, it's downright misogyny. I've heard the comments that the game looks automatically woke because it has a badass leading lady as the protagonist. Look, absolutely moronic biases aside, even those in the know tend to write it off as a very paint-by-numbers open-world game, and it pains me to hear that every single time. As someone who can't stand paint-by-numbers open-world games, Horizon Zero Dawn is the one I have always held on a pedestal as getting it right. Not that it necessarily changed the formula or anything, but it did the formula well. It made a lot of the standard bandit camps and radio towers and fetch quests so much more compelling than so many games before it. The three keys to its success, in my opinion, were the combat, the world design, and the story. Fundamentally, the combat is already awesome. Using primitive weapons to take down giant mecha beasts is amazing, and it only gets tougher and builds upon itself the further into the game you go. The world design is just fantastic. I mean, the level of detail and thought and the lore propping it all up is in a league of its own. I stand by the notion that the world created by this series is one of the most compelling sci-fi settings in gaming, period. And the story is genuinely fantastic. It takes a minute to get going, but once everything starts to unravel, it truly makes the game so much more than you'd think. And it's shockingly all too real, almost and unfortunately relatable in a lot of ways. There are weak points, sure. The facial animations and the voice acting here and there is a bit wonky. Some side quests are certainly better than others, and at times a glitch or two can still mess you up, but it's overall a wonderful experience. It was my favorite PlayStation exclusive from last generation. Yes, over God of War, over Bloodborne, over Spider-Man, over The Last of Us 2, over Uncharted 4, and even one of my other personal favorites, The Last Guardian, a game I loved oh so dearly. I say all this, obviously, to make the comparison to the sequel. Now, I obviously don't want to say too much about it because, well, we're still kind of in the thick of that Let's Play here on the channel. And I don't want to spoil anything major, but I do gotta talk at least a little about why I think Horizon Forbidden West is a very good game, but it also falls short of the first one. In some ways, it is better. I mean, traversal is leagues beyond Horizon Zero Dawn. You had to rely on fast travel quite a lot in the first game, for what is otherwise a much smaller map. Forbidden West is much more intelligently thought out in that regard. In fact, biases aside, I do think Forbidden West has a more interesting world. The map isn't just huge, but equally busy and layered, just like Zero Dawn's, full of interesting things to do and see. There's so little unused space, and that's a good thing. Video game worlds don't need to be big just for the sake of it. Forbidden West is also obviously a prettier game, of that there is no doubt. It's got more layers to its combat, it's got more things to do, for sure. But now we have to start dipping into the problems. Look, the very core of this series has me hooked, of that there is no doubt, and I have a lot of fun playing Forbidden West, almost to the point that I've gotten more hours out of it than I did with its predecessor. But it's also a longer game, and in a few ways, that's kind of a bad thing. Forbidden West does stray too far into the territory of bloat. I mean, I remember thinking Zero Dawn was an extremely robust experience that did more than a $60 game would ever need to do, not to mention the expansion, The Frozen Wilds. But Forbidden West is like both the last game and the expansion combined twice over. It's just so long, and it has an expansion of its own on the way. I'm sorry, but games do not need to be so excessive. I know a part of that just comes down to the side content, and if you were just to beeline the main story, it probably wouldn't be too bad. But now we get into the other issue. Is the payoff really worth it? Compared to the sequel, Zero Dawn is actually a very simple combat system. The amount of crafting and upgrade materials needed in that game is very scaled down, and was actually another thing I praised about it. It had those systems there, but they were so unintrusive and almost something you just did passively. You really spent a lot of time in menus figuring out what you needed next, really only ever for pouch upgrades. In Forbidden West, that is absolutely not the case. The number of materials for crafting has been more than doubled, and upgrade materials almost tenfold. You have to constantly create jobs for each and every armor and weapon piece you acquire to specifically target machine parts. And I'm sorry, but the default way of hunting down these parts is actually unbearable. It would completely ruin the game for me if there wasn't that difficulty option that allows you to just auto-loot every part off of a machine that you down. I could not play this game otherwise. They also nerfed certain things that were deemed too powerful in the first game, like melee combat, making it borderline useless this time around, while also designing a whole series of quests around it. It just doesn't work, nor does it make sense. And then there's the story. Again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but even from minute one, it's obvious. It's so very obvious that the story they told in Zero Dawn did not really have room to grow into a sequel. It needed to be something new, and you can really feel that in Forbidden West. There are good things about it. Excellent new characters, better writing than before, voice acting that's, well, still hit or miss sometimes, and a lot of interesting lore, all of which is much like the first game. But the actual act of continuation is just flimsy, to say the least. There's no way that this story was conceptualized and thought up ahead of time before Horizon Zero Dawn's sales success, before a sequel was actually greenlit. And I know that sounds redundant, but there's a process in world building that allows room for these sorts of contingencies, and it doesn't seem like the writers gave themselves a lot and just kind of built upon things that were more or less already fleshed out in the first game, and that's the issue. So why is this at number 2 then? Well, I think it's more telling that this isn't at number 1. I had every single intention of crowning this my game of the year, even when I was 40 hours in on my first playthrough. I love this game and a whole lot of things about it, but that realization slowly began to hit me that this is a very good game, but it is an overall downgrade, and I just can't in good conscience call it my favorite game of 2022 with so many caveats and disappointments. Not when this game has serious competition. I remember in 2017, I just didn't think anything came close to the quality of the first game. It was my top pick, and by a landslide. That's not to say there weren't other good games that year, but for me, it wasn't even a contest. This year, that's not the case. There's one other game that I covered that stands, I think, well above it, that has become one of my favorite video games of all time. Probably top 20, I don't know about top 10, but before we get to it, I should name a few honorable mentions. No Man's Sky was definitely the surprise of the year, a game I had no real expectations for because I'd already tried it in the past and was thoroughly underwhelmed. While I'm not about to say it completely set my world on fire, it is a very interesting game that gave me dozens of hours of things to do and led me along far enough to really want to explore for myself, set out, and accomplish a lot. While the game does still somewhat suffer from being an ocean of content, but without a lot of depth, it's certainly not the puddle it was in 2016. It's like waist high now, and at the very least it's worth exploring all the different avenues of gameplay before you call it quits. Kena Bridge of Spirits had a lot of things that instantly hooked me in a video game, and that art and animation style played a huge factor in keeping me strung along. While it wasn't anything super remarkable gameplay-wise, the presentation is some of the best I've ever seen, and it's just lovely to look at and take in from start to finish. I did enjoy some of the puzzles, a few of the odd side things, and following along the story was lovely. But the combat itself and some of the platforming is what kept me from absolutely loving this game as much as I wanted to. Medal of Honor Airborne was a nice blast to the past for me. I grew up on Frontline, Rising Sun, and European Assault as a kid and played them to absolute death. I've since done full Let's Plays of each game on the channel, but the thing is, the rest of the series never really grabbed me. From the PlayStation 1 games all the way up to the PC releases, to the handheld-only titles and the reboot and its sequel, they're just a dumpster fire of originality in particular. So leave it to the only game in the series that I haven't yet tried to be the closest to that Medal of Honor experience I remember. Airborne is a relatively simple and short time, with a campaign even smaller than my preferred trilogy, but it definitely reached into the deepest regions of my nostalgia and pulled me back more than a decade, which I really appreciated. On top of that, it does have the most refined shooting controls in the series, and is overall the most well put together. I really liked it, but again, I couldn't tell you it's an all-time favorite or anything. Not like, well, the game that sits at the top of this list. To properly talk about my #1 favorite game that we covered here on the channel in 2022, I gotta take you back to last year. So 2021 was kind of just a break on my part. I Let's Played Ghost of Tsushima, but I specifically did so because I knew that game was gonna be long and take me all year to do. And I didn't really want to not upload anything all year, so I just kind of spaced that one out enough so that I could focus on other things. A big part of those other things was just gaming. And I know that sounds weird, but I really don't have a lot of time to play video games on my own without my capture software and my microphone running. That's just kind of always been the case. But last year I was able to squeeze in a lot of other stuff, and I sort of just parsed through my gaming library specifically looking for seemingly interesting games that I'd wanted to play but never had. I beat 23 different games over the course of the year, and it's kind of what shifted my perspective on this channel and what I want to do here going forward. I had so much more fun spending time on all of these old games while waiting for the new stuff. Games like the original Ratchet & Clank, Brutal Legend, even Luigi's Mansion. Yeah, I know, it took me long enough. But there was one game in that whole batch that really stood out to me, and it was one that I had actually been avoiding up to that point. See, when the pandemic hit, Sony actually made a whole batch of games absolutely free to incentivize the whole stay-at-home campaign that was going around. You remember that, right? Maybe not the games themselves, because most of them were VR titles, but there were a few that were standalone enjoyable experiences. And let me tell you, the secret to a huge game library is just claiming every freebie at every chance you get. Trust me, I've been doing that for more than 10 years, and it's what makes up the majority of my digital collection. So I claimed them all, sat on them for a while, and this one game in the bunch I had seen on YouTube a few times, and it was always that game that really annoying influencers always would play so they could scream at it. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, there are dozens of those kinds of games, but they always just leave a bad taste in my mouth, which I actually don't know why. I mean, Amnesia: The Dark Descent and Outlast were kind of the originators of this entire concept, and they're awesome horror games, certainly. But I think, over the years, I began to notice the downward spiral where games were made solely for that purpose, and the games these people were screaming at just looked worse and worse, nearly asset flip levels of terrible. I say all this because I was first exposed to Subnautica right in the thick of that era. It just looked like another crap Steam game with a concept designed only to create jump scares. So by that same token, I was a little intrigued as to why Sony was offering this game in a group of otherwise really well put together titles, when this Subnautica thing just seemed like a years old meme. I mean, I knew it was getting a sequel, so it was definitely successful enough, but what made it actually worth playing? So naturally, I, an avid hater of survival games and an even bigger hater of meme games, and somebody who's generally not a fan of Deepwater in general, finally fired the whole thing up. And that really was the most magical experience I've had with a video game in years. First of all, I did kind of go all in. I did the smart thing and played this game in the dark with headphones on from start to finish. I totally immersed myself in it. And as I played and I got a handle on the systems and I found myself constantly on edge, I realized why. As much as this game rubbed me the wrong way before, I had never actually heard anything bad about it. It was all a hunch, a really dumb, poorly conceived hunch. And finally, as I was experiencing it for myself, it all made sense why. Subnautica is a survival game, but it is so much more than that. It is a sensory experience to the absolute extreme. For starters, no, it is not a horror game. In fact, unless you do suffer from thalassophobia, I doubt you'll really find it all that scary to begin with. But the tension is what's palpable, because this is a game that never lets you know how safe you actually are. Its usage of sound design, in particular, is stellar, beyond anything I have ever experienced in any video game ever. I seriously think it's the best that video games have ever managed to do. It's absolutely breathtaking in the way it uses open space and total obfuscation to disorient, confuse, and otherwise terrify the player in what is really a very simple and actually very easy survival game. It's not difficult at all. If you play patiently, it's downright trivial. For a game that tasks you with hunger, thirst, and oxygen is incredibly easy to maintain as long as you aren't careless. Hunger and thirst can be constantly and simply remedied from dozens of sources, and although a lot of things want to kill you, nothing really kills you all that easily. It's just that constant layer of, not fear, but uneasiness on top of every other task you're meant to complete that makes it so exciting. Another thing I love about this game is that it's not procedurally generated like nearly every other survival game out there. It's very deliberate in its design, and technically, you can look up a map and guide and know exactly what you're in for every step of the way. On the other hand, you really only get to experience it for the first time, and then after that, it's more of a sandbox where you look to test your limits instead. Experiment with higher difficulties, build precarious bases, and take down big sea monsters with a stasis gun, and a knife, but that first time is really special. I mean, just fantastic. The progression is genius, how the game just nudges you along, really allowing you to take things at your own pace, but daring you to go to more dangerous places if you want to get anywhere in the game. You have to put yourself in peril in this adventure. You have to go deeper to push your limits as a protagonist and as a player. But it's done so very naturally, without at all holding your hand. Never did I get stuck, but it did require a little patience from me. But that wasn't an issue because even in just doing menial tasks, I found myself really having to work for it. It was never tedious, which I think is always the bane of any survival game, but it was definitely stressful, or at the very least, I would describe it as thrilling whenever you would make a major breakthrough. To figure out the best fuel source for your bioreactor, to build yourself an unstoppable mech suit, or to finish the big and clunky submarine. These were all awesome, memorable moments that I could only appreciate because of the work to get me there, and not because the work itself was boring nor monotonous. This has to be one of the most deceptive gaming experiences I've ever had. You can't quite understand what it's like until you take the plunge yourself, and I mean that. I really do think Subnautica is special, and that feeling is only furthered by the way the sequel turned out. A sequel that, while I don't think it's as bad as most people say, it definitely misunderstands what made the first game so good on a fundamental level. It borrows from and iterates on so many of Subnautica's mechanics, yet takes a major step back in almost every area that matters. That's why Subnautica feels like lightning in a bottle, like a happy accident. Because I've checked. I still hate every other survival game out there. Believe me, they just do not work with me at all. But this game is not only an exception, it's exceptional. Oh, and the soundtrack? Don't even get me started.